In today's video, I want to talk about creating custom modes for your camera. You're probably familiar with the program and aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual modes and the automatic mode that are on your camera dial, but a lot of cameras also have custom modes that you can pre-save groups of settings, and that way when you find yourself in that same situation that requires those specific settings again in the future, you can just turn your dial back to that custom mode. Your camera will revert back to those pre-saved settings. I use it all the time here when I'm in the Disney parks because most of the dark rides I've found to set up the same set of settings works pretty consistently across all the different dark rides. I'm going to share with you all the settings I use, how I set my camera up for photographing a dark ride, and how I save those settings. So the first setting we need to think about is our shutter speed. That's the most important one. That's the one that's going to really make or break whether or not we have successful images coming out of these dark rides. I found that a 1/160th of a second is a good place to start. It's not the perfect shutter speed. It's not the one that I use every single time, all the time, but it's a good starting point. And so that's the shutter speed that I set my custom mode for. That way I always go back to that start point, that reference point. And if I need to bump it up or bump it down a little bit, go down to 120, go up to 250, it's not that far of an adjustment from 160 right in the middle. And most of the time, 160 is gonna get me what I wanna get. So we're gonna first put our camera in manual mode, and we're going to select 1/160th of a second as our shutter speed. Once we've selected our shutter speed, we now need to select our aperture. And this is where it might get tricky if you shoot with multiple lenses that have different maximum apertures like I do. The trick is, go and find the fastest aperture lens that you're likely to shoot with. Grab that and throw it on your camera. For me, it's an f1.2 Olympus. I've got a couple lenses with an f1.2 aperture. Put that lens on the camera. This is important. It has to actually be on the camera. And now set your aperture as wide as it can go. Set it all the way to f1.2. Once you save that setting and your camera says, when you're in this custom mode, you want f1.2, let's say the lens you have on the camera at the time only goes to f4. When you dial into that custom mode, the camera knows it can't go to f1.2, but it does know to open the aperture as wide as it can for whatever lens is on there. Because again, photography is about light. Dark rides especially are all about light. And so one of the ways we ensure all the light available is going to the sensor is by leaving that aperture as wide open as we can and leaving it there. We never touch it again. The next setting we're going to dial in is our metering mode. We need to tell the camera how we want it to measure the light in the scene. And you're probably thinking, well, if we're in manual mode, we've manually dialed in our aperture and we've manually dialed in our shutter speed, why do we care how the camera meters the scene? Aren't we metering the scene with our brain? No. I'm getting to that part. Set your metering mode to spot metering. Again, dark rides have a lot of black background and they have subjects that are lit very, very well, and we want to expose for the subject. We don't care about the background. We want that just black background if we can get it. So spot metering will let the camera adjust the exposure for the subject no matter how it's lit. So make sure you have spot metering set as your metering mode. And then for your ISO, set your ISO to automatic. So our shutter speed is not going to change. Our aperture is not going to change, but our ISO is going to go up or down based on what the scene needs. If it's very, very dark, yeah, your camera's gonna raise the ISO a little bit. If it's really, really bright, your camera's gonna lower the ISO down into the 100s, 200s, 80s, somewhere fairly low. Now you can go into your camera's settings and set the range for your auto ISO. You can set a maximum value and a minimum value. So let's say your particular camera, you hate the way shots look above ISO 6400. You can tell the camera, use auto ISO, just don't raise it above, in this example, 6400. I have mine set a lot higher than that because I'd rather get the shot and have a grainy shot than have no shot at all. So I have mine set to like 25,600. That way I'm gonna get the shot. The camera's gonna have enough power to at least focus and meter the scene. But I like having the extra range. I am comfortable with the noise. I suggest you learn to start getting comfortable with the noise. Don't be afraid of a high ISO. Use auto ISO. Okay, the next one to adjust is going to be your autofocus mode. We want to know how the camera is going to focus. you want to select whatever your camera manufacturer calls their tracking autofocus. Continuous autofocus with tracking is what Olympus calls it, or what OM System now calls it. So I select the continuous autofocus tracking with manual focus override capability. It's a mouthful, but basically I half press the shutter and I start shooting. And once my camera identifies a subject, it does a pretty good job of keeping that subject in focus, regardless of whether it's moving towards me, away from me, whether I'm moving towards it, away from it. And that ensures that as I'm shooting that burst of photos, most of them will end up being in focus. You do not want a single point focus. You do not want manual focus. And then set your autofocus point to just the middle of the frame. Just a small autofocus point in the middle of the frame. That way you know where it is, and you can always drive that part of the frame towards your subject. Half press to lock, and then you can recompose. The last one you want to select is your drive mode. And this, you're going to want to select something that's pretty fast. Not necessarily as fast as your camera can shoot, because some cameras can shoot 120 frames a second. You maybe don't want to burn up that much memory. But select something that's going to give you a lot of usable shots to choose from, so you can choose the best moment out of the images you captured. For me, that's between 10 and 20 frames per second. I find that that's enough to give me a good selection of shots to choose from, but not so many that I'm filtering through tens of thousands of shots after each trip. If you're more selective with your shooting, maybe go 5, 6, 7, 8 shots a second. Whatever suits your fancy, but make sure you give yourself the best chance possible to choose the best image. You don't want to do single shot. You want, I'd say, at least 5. 10 is a good number to shoot for, if your camera can do it. So in addition to those 6 main settings, there are a few other ones I want to mention real quickly in case you don't already have them dialed in. Shoot in RAW. Just do it. Just shoot in RAW. RAW captures a larger file that gives you a lot more plasticity when it comes to editing and processing your photos, especially if you want to do noise reduction or color correction. RAW gives you the flexibility you need to make stuff look really, really good. And then the last setting is one that not all cameras can do, but I like to remap some of the buttons on my camera so that I can control which dial adjusts my shutter speed and which dial adjusts my ISO. Like most cameras, their manual mode is set up where one dial adjusts the aperture and one dial adjusts the shutter speed. But like I mentioned earlier, we're not really going to do anything with our aperture once we lock it all the way open, so we don't really need to have fast access to our aperture control. I would way rather have fast access to my ISO. So go into your settings and make one dial your shutter speed and one dial your ISO. And that way, if you want to maybe come out of auto ISO and dial down to a specific ISO for a certain shot, you can do that just with a roll of your thumb. Same thing with shutter speed. So I tend to make the front dial the shutter speed control, just because the front dial is closer to the shutter button. So my brain just goes, all the shutter stuff gets adjusted with my index finger, and then I make the rear dial the ISO dial, just because the rear dial is closer to the back of the camera where all the other settings are. That's just how it works in my head. Front dial shutter, back dial ISO. Before we get to the part of actually how to save all this to a custom setting, there's one more that I forgot. It's if you are using a camera that has multiple card slots. So if you're using a pro camera, usually from Olympus, Sony, Canon, Nikon, there are models that have multiple card slots, either 2 SDs, 2 CFs, one of each. If you're shooting a lot of RAW files, shooting a lot of large files, shooting at high drive modes, set your card settings so that all your images save to one card, and then when that card gets full, it starts saving to the other card. That way you put 2 large memory cards in the camera and you're never going to have to worry about getting that SD card full message during the shooting day. So I have 2 256 gigabyte SD cards in my camera, and I have it set to shoot 20 frames per second RAW. So I usually come home from a trip with anywhere between 10 and 30,000 photos, depending on the length of the trip. So it's a lot to have to sort through, but I don't have to change memory cards. I don't have to dump files onto a device at the end of the night, and it's just one less thing to worry about, and it's less equipment to bring on a trip. So that's just my personal preference. I know other people like to bring lots of small memory cards and change them out during the day because they're worried about losing images and corrupting files. And It's never been an issue for me. So you do you, but you know, those are my recommendations. So now let's talk about how to set all this stuff and save it into a custom mode. On my camera, I've just created a shortcut. I press the trash can button because I can reach it with my right hand. It takes me to a custom menu I've created where I can then go into the custom modes. I tell it I want to save it into slot number 1, select set again, and you're done. Now whenever I turn the top dial on my camera to C1, all of the settings in the camera, no matter what I have dialed in there, will revert back to that custom mode. And they'll never change unless I go back into that custom setting and save something else under slot C1. Super, super easy. All right, so now that we've got that custom mode created and saved, it's time to dial into that custom mode. Number 1 is what I designated as in my camera. So I'm gonna go test out how well these settings work on Pinocchio's Daring Journey, which I think is probably one of the most challenging dark rides because it is properly dark and you do need a high ISO and a fast aperture to make that 1/160th of the shutter speed work. So let's go. There you have it. It does work. Hope it works for you. Take these settings home, try them yourself, see how it works on your camera with your lenses. You might need to make some minor tweaks based on what you have available and what you like, but I hope this gave you a good starting point. That was really all I'm hoping to do, is give you a good place to get started and start really digging into the settings on what your camera can do on these types of rides. So thanks for watching. Hope you found this informative. Hope you found it entertaining, and I will see you soon in the next video. Thanks.